It never begins with the truth. It begins with something smaller, something deceptively insignificant, something that can be misunderstood just enough to become dangerous. And this story began not with a confession or a headline or even a rumor whispered by someone close to the truth, but with a photograph so ordinary it should have disappeared into the endless churn of celebrity imagery. A blurred frame captured from across a Los Angeles street where nothing ever truly happens and everything is always being watched. A single frozen moment showing Dakota Johnson mid-stride, wrapped in an oversized coat as if trying to vanish inside it, moving quickly as though instinct itself was urging her not to linger, and for just a fraction of a second her hand rested on her stomach. Not dramatically, not deliberately, but naturally, the way people do when they are thinking, protecting, grounding themselves, and that was all it took, because the internet does not need certainty, it only needs suggestion, and by the time anyone asked whether the photograph meant anything at all, the narrative had already outrun reality at full speed. Within hours, the image was everywhere, cropped, zoomed, sharpened, slowed down, replayed through the familiar machinery of online obsession, and what mattered was not what the photograph actually showed but what people wanted it to confirm. Because long before that moment, long before that street and that coat and that instinctive gesture, the story had already been written in the public imagination, waiting patiently for an excuse to resurface, and the names at the center of it, Dakota Johnson and Jamie Dornan, had never truly been allowed to separate, no matter how much time passed, no matter how many interviews were given, no matter how many lives were lived in between. The headlines arrived fast and loud, not cautiously but triumphantly, as if a mystery had finally solved itself, as if the internet had been proven right all along, and the phrasing was never tentative, never responsible, never interested in restraint. Dakota Johnson expecting, Jamie Dornan seen nearby, secret confirmed, truth finally exposed, and embedded inside those words was the implication that this was not new, not sudden, but inevitable, the long-awaited payoff to a narrative that had been quietly maintained for years by fans, tabloids, and an industry that understands one uncomfortable truth better than it ever admits. Unfinished stories are more valuable than resolved ones. It did not matter that it had been nearly a decade since 50 Shades of Grey dominated pop culture. It did not matter that both actors had repeatedly moved on, reshaped their careers, constructed public identities deliberately designed to outgrow that chapter, because some associations refuse to die when the audience believes they own them, and Jamie and Dakota had never been allowed to become simply colleagues who once shared a role. They had been transformed into symbols, projections, vessels for longing, fantasy, and unresolved emotional investment that no press tour could dismantle. Every few months, like clockwork, the same whispers resurfaced. A dinner spotted through restaurant windows, a glance misinterpreted on a red carpet, a comment taken out of context, and each time the story faded again, unresolved but intact, waiting for the next trigger. And this time that trigger came disguised as a potential child, because nothing inflames speculation faster than the suggestion of permanence, of consequence, of something that cannot be undone or dismissed as coincidence. What made this moment different was not just the implication of pregnancy, but the way it reframed everything retroactively, because once a child enters the imagined narrative, suddenly every past interaction is rewritten, every interview reinterpreted, every smile becomes evidence, every silence becomes guilt, and the public does what it always does best. It builds certain out of fragments and calls it truth. Jamie Dornan was not even in the same country when the photograph detonated online. He was in Ireland, working, distant from the physical center of the storm but not from its consequences, because distance has never protected anyone from a narrative once it gains momentum. And by the time his name began trending alongside words like a fair and secret child, the story had already solidified into something that felt unshakable, not because it was proven, but because it was satisfying. This was not the first time rumors had brushed against his life, but it was the first time they carried the weight of something irreversible, something that threatened not just his public image but the carefully guarded architecture of his private world, the one he had spent years constructing away from the shadow of Christian Grey, away from the caricature of intensity and dominance that had once defined him in the eyes of millions, away from the idea that he was perpetually entangled in a fantasy he had long since stepped out of. Jamie Dornan had rebuilt himself deliberately. As a husband who stayed largely out of spectacle, as a father whose children were shielded from the industry that consumed him, as an actor choosing restraint over exposure, And none of that mattered now because the internet does not reward restraint, it punishes it, interpreting silence as permission, privacy as concealment, and dignity as something to be dismantled. Amelia Warner's name entered the conversation not because she spoke, not because she reacted, but because she did not. And in the logic of modern scandal, silence is never neutral. It is dissected, weaponized, and transformed into narrative fuel, and soon every appearance she made, every event she skipped, every photograph taken at the wrong angle became part of a story she had not chosen to participate in, her composure reframed as calculation, her restraint misread as resignation. She stays silent. Oh, one outlet wrote, as though silence were a strategy rather than a boundary, but her silence speaks volumes. Because the press has always been uncomfortable with women who refuse to perform the emotions expected of them, especially when those emotions would make the story easier to sell. Online, the division was immediate and brutal. Camps formed not around facts, but around belief. Those who insisted they had always known there was something more, something unfinished, something undeniable between Jamie and Dakota, and those who defended him fiercely, arguing that the world had learned nothing from years of manufactured scandal. But both sides shared the same flaw. They were arguing about a version of events that existed almost entirely in their own imaginations. By the time Jamie returned from filming, the story had metastasized beyond rumor into perceived inevitability, and what should have been dismissed as speculation had hardened into something dangerously close to conviction. Because when repetition replaces evidence, people stop asking whether a story is true and start asking only how it will end. And then, just as the noise reached its peak, something happened that no one expected and everyone misinterpreted. A podcast appearance, quiet, controlled, intimate, meant to promote work, not address chaos, became the moment the entire narrative pivoted. Not because Jamie intended it to, but because once a story reaches a certain volume, even the smallest opening becomes a trapdoor. The question was asked carefully but without innocence, framed as curiosity rather than accusation. And in the brief pause that followed, the room changed, because hesitation is never invisible. And when Jamie leaned back, clasped his hands, and let his gaze drift somewhere far beyond the microphone, it was already too late to stop. What would come next. What he said, or rather, what was extracted from what he said, would be replayed thousands of times, stripped of context, sharpened into certainty, and used as the final piece of proof that the internet had been waiting for. But what almost no one noticed in that moment was not the words themselves, but the weight behind them, the absence of triumph, the lack of performance, the quiet gravity of a man speaking not from impulse, but from something far older and far more complicated. Because this was never a story about scandal in the way the headlines needed it to be. It was a story about ownership, of narratives, of memories, of emotional bonds that do not dissolve simply because time passes. And the reason it exploded the way it did was not because it revealed something forbidden, but because it exposed something the public has never been comfortable acknowledging. That intimacy does not always end cleanly, that connection does not always follow rules, and that the most dangerous truths are the ones that refuse to fit inside the boxes we build for them. And the moment Jamie Dornan spoke those words, words that would be cut, clipped, and broadcast without mercy, the world believed it had finally caught him confessing. What the world did not yet understand was that it had mistaken confession for something else entirely. And by the time that distinction became clear, the damage and the revelation would already be irreversible. The internet did not wait for the full sentence because it never does, and by the time the clip had finished buffering on millions of screens around the world, the meaning had already been decided, flattened into something simpler, louder, and far more profitable than the truth could ever be. Yes, she's carrying my child. 6 words, torn loose from the breath that carried them, severed from the pause that followed, isolated like a confession extracted under pressure. And once they were free, they no longer belonged to Jamie Dornan at all. They belonged to the machine. Within minutes, those words were everywhere, stacked into headlines like verdicts, repeated by voices that grew more certain with each retelling. Jamie confirms secret child. Jamie admits affair. Jamie Dornan finally exposed. The certainty was intoxicating because certainty always is, especially when it relieves people of the burden of thinking further. The world prefers answers that end the conversation, not truths that complicate it. And so no one asked why his voice had sounded almost subdued, why there had been no trace of pride or defiance, why his expression looked less like a man caught and more like a man surrendering something fragile. The machinery of outrage moved faster than context ever could. Clips were trimmed to perfection, engineered to provoke maximum reaction in minimum time, and the silence after his words, the silence where meaning actually lived, was surgically removed. Pauses do not perform well in algorithms. Nuance does not trend. Ambiguity does not convert. So it was discarded. By the time Jamie's publicist's phone began to ring, the story had already outrun any attempt at correction. Calls from journalists were not requests for clarity. They were requests for confirmation. Talk shows prepared segments before statements existed. Panels of strangers debated timelines they had invented. The question was no longer if something had happened, but how long it had been hidden. And once that shift occurs, denial becomes irrelevant. In the court of public opinion, denial is simply another form of guilt. Amelia Warner's world narrowed abruptly, not through confrontation but through observation. Cameras appeared where they had never lingered before. Every entrance and exit became a potential headline. Her stillness was framed as strategy. Her absence was reframed as evidence. The ring on her finger became a symbol to be analyzed rather than a private choice. And through it all, she said nothing, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood something the internet rarely does. Reacting too soon hands control to the narrative you're reacting to. But silence, in moments like this, is a provocation. It invites projection. And so the projections multiplied. Sympathy turned quickly into speculation. Sympathy, after all, is less engaging than betrayal. Viewers did not want to watch a woman endure. They wanted to watch a woman break. When that did not happen, frustration crept in, and frustration always seeks somewhere to land. Dakota Johnson, meanwhile, became less a person and more a symbol of temptation, of unfinished business, of a fantasy the public had never allowed to dissolve. Her pregnancy, real and visible now through relentless surveillance, was no longer treated as a personal milestone but as a plot device. Every step she took was filmed. Every doctor's visit was timed. Her body became public property not because she had offered it, but because the story demanded access. And still, neither she nor Jamie rushed to clarify. This refusal to perform explanation was interpreted as arrogance by some, cruelty by others, and strategy by most. But in reality, it was something far less calculated and far more human: hesitation. Because once a clarification is issued, it does not end the story, it feeds it. And both of them knew that whatever they said would not be heard as it was intended, only as it could be weaponized. It was not until the full podcast episode aired later that evening that a crack appeared in the certainty everyone had rushed to build. Not a collapse. Cracks never collapse narratives immediately, but enough to unsettle the most attentive listeners. Because when the unedited audio continued, it did not follow the arc people had assumed. There was no triumphant declaration. No romantic framing. No implication of secrecy or deceit. Instead, there was a pause, long, uncomfortable, human, and then words that felt almost out of place in a scandal-driven world. Not in the way people think. Those 7 words landed softly, without drama, and that was precisely the problem. They did not fit the story. They did not inflame. They did not accuse or confess. They complicated, and so most outlets ignored them. But for those who listened closely, what followed was not an attempt to escape responsibility, but an attempt to redefine it. Jamie spoke not like a man cornered, but like someone finally acknowledging something he had never known how to articulate publicly. He spoke about shared experience rather than shared beds, about survival rather than desire, about a bond forged under pressure so intense that it permanently altered the people inside it. He spoke about what happens when 2 people are thrown into a cultural phenomenon that strips them of anonymity, distorts their identities, and demands emotional availability on a scale few are prepared for. He spoke about the aftermath, the quiet years no one sees, where the adrenaline fades and the psychological residue remains. He did not say we were lovers. He did not say this child is mine. What he said was far more unsettling to a culture that prefers clean lines. Connection does not disappear just because it becomes inconvenient. It's not about biology, he said, and the room felt different after that. It's about connection. Connection, that was the word the headlines could not use because connection implies Continuity without transgression, intimacy without betrayal, care without possession. Connection suggests that responsibility can exist without ownership, and that idea threatens a narrative economy built entirely on labels. By the time this fuller context circulated, the damage was already layered too deeply to undo. Corrections never travel as far as accusations. Clarifications never trend as hard as outrage. And so the world split again, not between those who believed and those who doubted, but between those willing to sit with complexity and those who rejected it outright. Jamie, notably, refused to walk the statement back. He did not issue a follow-up apology. He did not release a carefully crafted clarification designed to soothe sponsors and silence critics. When urged to explain himself further, his response was simple and quietly defiant. He had said exactly what he meant. How people chose to hear it was no longer his responsibility. That decision, not to chase the narrative, was interpreted as recklessness by some and integrity by others, but its consequences were immediate and personal. Amelia Warner, after days of being spoken about rather than listened to, finally broke her silence. Not with a press release, not with an interview, but with a single sentence posted without comment or elaboration. The truth often sounds like love, even when people want it to sound like betrayal. It was devastating in its restraint. No names, no accusations, no defense. Just a quiet assertion that reframed everything the public thought it understood. In one line, she reclaimed authorship of her own emotional landscape, refusing both victimhood and spectacle. The reaction was immediate. Praise flooded in, not just because of what she said, but because of how she said it. Grace, dignity, composure, words the internet loves to assign after the fact, often to soothe its own guilt. But behind that calm, those close to the family described something else entirely. Not anger, not jealousy, but exhaustion. Not from the rumor itself, but from the speed with which the world had been willing to misunderstand. For Amelia, the wound was not the suggestion of infidelity. She knew her marriage. It was the realization of how easily complexity is punished, how quickly emotional honesty is flattened into scandal. This was not her first brush with public speculation, but it was the first time it had tried to rewrite her reality so aggressively. Dakota Johnson watched all of this unfold from inside a body that no longer belonged solely to her, at least not in the public imagination. For days she said nothing, and in that silence the story mutated again, filling the vacuum with assumptions that grew increasingly detached from anything she had actually lived. By the time she finally agreed to address the chaos during a virtual interview, expectations were already set. The world expected denial, or confirmation, or defiance. What it received instead was something far more destabilizing. "There's nothing to clear up," she said calmly, almost gently, as if surprised by the premise of the question. Jamie spoke from his heart, and in some ways, he's right. That sentence did not extinguish the fire. It rearranged it, because now the story could no longer be framed as one-sided fantasy or opportunistic rumor. It had to account for mutual recognition, for shared history, for a bond that neither person was willing to disown, even under pressure. But Dakota drew the line clearly, without hostility, without embarrassment. The child she was carrying belonged to her present, not her past. Jamie's role was not paternal in the biological sense, but relational in a way that defied the language available to describe it cleanly. He cared, perhaps more than was convenient, perhaps more than was expected. But care, she implied, is not a crime that I end that moment. The scandal lost its clean edges. It became harder to sell, harder to package, harder to resolve. And when stories become difficult, the media begins to lose interest. Still, something had shifted irreversibly. Not in the facts, those had not changed, but in the public's understanding of what it had been consuming all along. This was never about an affair. It was about ownership of narrative, about the discomfort society feels when emotional bonds refuse to obey its rules. And yet, even as the frenzy began to soften, something else lingered beneath the surface. A question few were asking aloud, but many were beginning to feel. If Jamie Dornan had not been confessing guilt, if Dakota Johnson had not been revealing scandal, if Amelia Warner had not been betrayed, Then what exactly had this moment exposed? Because sometimes the most unsettling stories are not the ones about wrongdoing, but the ones that reveal how poorly we understand the quiet, enduring forms of love that exist beyond romance. The kinds of bonds that survive fame, survive time, and survive misunderstanding. And that realization, once it takes hold, does not disappear easily.